Well, good morning. It's great to be here. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Alan Peel, the new assistant pastor, and it's lovely to be here. If you have a Bible, do please open it up at 2 Samuel chapter 10, what was read to us. If you haven't got a Bible, then it's in the meeting guide. It would be good to have that open in front of you as we go through it. Well, I wonder, as a starter question that will divide us probably one or two ways. I wonder if you're a fan of roller coasters. There's some people that would say, yes, love them. Some hands going up there. We love the thrill of it. We love being thrown around. I would probably put myself in that category on that side. And then there's other people, and they would say, absolutely not. Can't think of anything worse. Why on earth would you willingly put yourself in a seat and be thrown around and made to feel sick? I wonder, though, what would you say is the best bit or the worst bit of being on a roller coaster? One of my favorite bits is the beginning. And I spoke to a few people who don't like them, and they would say this is the worst bit. So you've got in your seat, the barriers come down, you know that you're safe, you know you're strapped in, and then you leave the loading bay, and you make that slow rise up. And you're just sat there. You can't back out. There's no way of getting out of it now. You're just there. And you're sat at some unnatural angle as slowly it goes to the top. Click, click, click. And the anticipation builds, doesn't it? And the butterflies start going crazy. And you know, you can see ahead, you can see that it's track, and then suddenly it's just sky. And you know that you've got to that peak, almost at the peak, and you know that within seconds you're going to go over and you're going to drop. Yeah, that for me is one of my favorite bits. And this week, chapter 10 of 2 Samuel has felt a little bit like that for me. As I've been sat there reading through it, we've seen in 2 Samuel as David has become king of Israel, and slowly he has risen, hasn't he? He has got stronger, more powerful. Israel has prospered under him. We saw in chapter 8, he has defeated his enemies, and Israel and David have been on the rise. But we know, with the life of David, that there is that shadow on the horizon, don't we? We know that there's a peak, and then beyond the peak there is a sudden drop as David falls into sin. Well, that's where we are. We're at the peak. David and Israel have been on the rise, but as we turn over the page in chapter 11, that drop that we're anticipating, that thing that we know is there that's coming, is right there. Now, a lot of roller coasters will do this thing where they'll take you to the top and then they'll stop, won't they? And they'll let you sit as you enjoy the view. Do you enjoy the view? You sit and you just take a moment before that drop comes to just see how high you are. And I think that chapter 10, again, is a little bit, this morning what I want to do is just pause and to see where Israel is, where David is, before we hit the drop next week. Well, chapter 10 is a fascinating chapter. The saying goes, doesn't it, that truth is stranger than fiction. And I think we have a little bit of that here in this chapter. It's fascinating. There's so much going on. And when I first read it, when I got the rota through, I thought, what is happening here? What am I going to say? But actually, the more I've read it, the more I've got into it, the more I've loved it. It's a fascinating chapter. And so what I want us to do is just to go through it, to go through and see what happens, to see how the writer has constructed this together. I'm convinced that the writer isn't just recording history for us here. He's not just filling pages. He's not just saying, well, before we get to the juicy stuff, I just need to just kind of say that there was a couple of battles that took place. The writer has constructed this carefully, and even verse 4, in all of its awkwardness, plays into that. And so I want us to walk through it and see what's happening, and then before we close, we'll kind of take a bit of a deeper dive and see what can it teach us today. What does it tell us in our situation today? So it begins then It actually begins in a very similar way to chapter 9. I don't know if you picked up on that. Chapter 9, we have Mephibosheth, the story of Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, and David wants to show kindness to one of the sons of Jonathan because of a commitment he made to Jonathan. And then we come off the back of that chapter, where we see Mephibosheth eating at the king's table. We have that the king of the Ammonites died, and his son, Hanun, succeeded him, as king. And so David thought, I will show kindness to Hanun, the son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. Now, we don't know. I'm going to put it out there straight away. We don't know what this is talking about. We don't know what event this is. Scripture never tells us of Nahash showing kindness to David. So I've looked into it. I don't really know what this is. Many commentators believe that when David was on the run from Saul, when King Saul, king of Israel before David, when he wanted to kill him, he had to flee Saul, and many nations around about Israel who were considered enemies helped David out. And so a lot of commentators believe that Nahash helped David in this moment. If he did, Scripture is silent on it. But we do know that Nahash and Saul were not friends. In fact, when Saul became king, his first victory was over Nahash. So they were enemies. And so it's probable, that when David and Saul were enemies, Nahash helped David against a common enemy. It could literally just be down to politics, that when David became king, Nahash sent a gift of kindness, which was kind of common within that kind of world. We don't know what's happened, but we do know two things as we see this verse. Firstly, David has a sorrow over the death of Nahash. Whatever's gone on, we don't know. Scripture is silent on it, but David has a sorrow for the death of this man. And he wants to express sympathy, and he feels an obligation. Secondly, he has an obligation towards Nahash and towards his son to repay that kindness. Whatever it was, he wants to then repay it. And so we see that David has sympathy, and he sends off his delegation to go and express that to Hanun. But then it's not met as it's intended, is it? He means this in sympathy, he means this in kindness, but when they come to the land, the commanders who are advising this king, they convince Hanun, however we pronounce that, they convince him that it's all a trick, it's a scam, that there is something dodgy going on here, that David hasn't really sent his people to show sympathy and kindness, but instead he sent them to spy out the land in order that he might overthrow it. And so David has sent this envoy, and they are rejected, and we are given a lot of detail in how they are rejected, aren't we? Verse 4, we read that they seized these guys, and they greatly humiliated them. They shaved off half of their beards, and they cut their clothes in order to expose them. Now, my original intention was to just ignore this verse was in there and just pass over it. But actually, I think it's kind of a key verse. And we'll see as we go on that there's a bit of a theme throughout the chapter as the writer has constructed this together. And actually, throughout 2 Samuel and even in this passage, there's parts where the writer has given us hardly any detail whatsoever. When it comes to the 2 battles later on, there's not really much detail about what goes on. But here, he felt the need to put a lot of detail in. And I think there's a reason for that. As we see not only that they were humiliated, he could have just said that they humiliated them and sent them off. But instead, he tells us how. I think some of that is the writer wants us to share in their humiliation. I think that kind of awkward laugh that we do when it's read, that's kind of what he wants us to have. To think, wow, these have been made a fool of. These have been really humiliated. And they've been sent away. And then we see David hears of this. We see the kindness and the love of David in that he sends men to greet them. And he says to them, look, go to Jericho. He doesn't add to their humiliation by telling them to come back to Jerusalem. He says, go to Jericho, sort your beards out, and then you can come back after that. We see again, just as a side note, the love of David he has here the kindness he shows. And so all of that takes place, and in verse 6, Ammon, they now realize that they've made a bit of a mistake, don't they? The original is kind of like that they've become a stench to David. They've become a bad smell, something that is repulsive to him and that he must get rid of. That's how they view themselves now before David because of what they've done. They think, well, we need to prepare for this. They are not big enough or strong enough to defeat Israel on their own, so they hire in some extra guys, don't they? We see that they get in people from Aramea. They get people from these other nations that are mentioned as well, the king of Makar and from Tob. 33,000 extra soldiers they hire. So they're paying for guys to come and help them in this battle. They've picked a fight they can't win. Have you ever heard pick on someone your own size? Well, they've not done that, have they? They've picked a fight against an enemy they can't beat, and now they're trying to hire in help in order that they might win. And so David, he hears that they've lined up for battle. He sends Joab with his entire army to go and to meet them and to fight against them. But they've been clever. Well, they think they've been clever. And they've created this tactic. So they've lined up outside their city. The people of Ammon have lined up outside their city. And they are braced for battle. And as Joab is marching towards them, he notices that there's some others hiding out in the field who are now coming from behind. It's kind of, I think, I don't want to try and give the impression I know these things. This is purely research. I think it's called a flank tactic. Flank being your side. And so as you have an army coming towards you, you attack them with another army or with a kind of a separate group from the side or from behind. Fairly common tactic within warfare, apparently. And that's what's going on here. So Joab now, he's marching towards them, and he notices there's this extra group. What's he going to do? Is he going to flee? Is he going to retreat? That's a common kind of thing to do in this situation, apparently. But Joab, he stays cool and calm under pressure. We heard 2 weeks ago from Graham, at the end of chapter 8, there's a role to play in the kingdom according to your gifts. And we saw there that Joab was made the commander of the army. And we maybe see a little bit of the why here. That in the heat of the battle, he stays calm. And he devises this change of tactics. He takes the best of the guys, a smaller group of people, but the better ones. And he takes them off to fight this extra attack. And he leads his brother Abishai to take the rest of them to continue towards Ammon. And he doesn't know how it's going to end. We'll come back to this a bit later on. And he says, look, be strong, be courageous, let's go and fight. But there's not much fighting that goes on, is there? So he prepares for battle, they've prepared for battle, and then, amazingly, the people, they just run away. I think that they probably expected Joab to flee. They weren't really prepared for battle. They expected Joab to, in this moment, to retreat, but he doesn't, so now they're the ones who retreat. And this is, I think we see a little bit now, it's beginning to grow, of why verse 4 has so much detail. Because David's servants, they look silly, don't they? But now who looks silly? Ammon has hired in 33,000 soldiers to help him fight, and when it actually comes to it, they run away. He's hired them in order to help him, and instead they've fled. And so the response then of the Ammonites, verse 14, when they realize that they've run, well, they run away. I love the verse that comes at the end of verse 14. So Joab returned from fighting. There's not really much fighting that's gone on, but he's returned from it anyway. When I was younger, here's probably something that you should probably know about me. I'm a bit of a wimp, okay? I'll put it out there straight away. I don't like being wet and I don't like being cold. And that has been true my whole life. But I used to do this thing when I was a child, and I would say to my sisters, I've got two older sisters, I've got a younger brother who's much younger than me, so he wasn't around at this time. But I'd say to my sisters, shall we have a water fight? During the summer, nice hot day, let's have a water fight. It was such a great idea. Did you have water fights? Yeah? And I would suggest having a water fight. My sisters would say, yeah, let's do this. Let's have a water fight. And then we'd prepare for it. I would go and get changed. I'd load up the water pistol. I'd make sure it was pressurized. I'd get some water bombs. If we had any water bombs, I'd get them as well. I'd work out in the garden where I was going to hide. I'd be fully prepared. But remember, I don't like being cold and I don't like being wet. So as soon as the battle began and there was any hint of me getting cold or wet, I would run inside and close the door. And it became like an on-running joke when I'd suggest a water fight. No, because all you're going to do is run inside. That's a little bit of what they're doing here. It's childish, isn't it? It's almost laughable that when it actually comes to the point of doing what they're supposed to be doing, they just run away. Well, this gets back to the king of the Arameans, Hadadezer. He's already been defeated by David in chapter 8. He thinks, no, we have been made to look a bit silly here. We're going to regroup. And he calls in more people from even further away. The river Euphrates, according to Google Maps, if you start at the river Euphrates and you walk to the river Jordan, it would take you 6 days. So he's really stretched out his net here to get as many people in as he can in order that he might now defeat David. But what happens? It doesn't work, does it? They draw the battle lines. David comes out to meet them with Joab and the army. They kill 40,000 foot soldiers, 700 charioteers, and in the end, they end up running away again. And then we've got this great verse 19. The kings who were vassals, that's people that are underneath Hadadezer, are under his control. When they saw that they had been routed or defeated by Israel, they made peace with the Israelites and became subject to them. So David is continuing to grow stronger and stronger. Even people beyond the Euphrates are now at peace with Israel. So we see that continued rise, don't we? The enemies of God, the enemies of God's nation and God's people have rallied against them, and yet God has given the victory and there is peace. And then we just end with this last verse, or the last sentence, at the end. So the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites anymore. This king, Hanun, he really looks silly now, doesn't he? And I think there's a little bit of a role reversal here. So he takes David's men, he shaves off half their beards, he exposes them and leaves them looking humiliated and silly. And now, at the end of the chapter, it is Hanun, it's the Ammonites who've been left shaved of half their military strength. They're exposed before a greater enemy, and the laugh is on them, isn't it? Who has the last laugh? It's a fantastic chapter, isn't it? And I wanted to walk us through that just so we can kind of pick up. I think the writer, there's a kind of a satirical humor to this. That he's made a fool of these guys, but at the end of the chapter, he is the one who now looks like the fool. In making a fool of David's servants, it all backfires, and he is the one now who is exposed. And chapter 11 and chapter 12, this battle will continue. It will rage on. And at the end of chapter 12, we read that David will come and he will muster his enemy, against his entire army against the enemy, and he will take the crown from the king's head and he will plunder the cities. So this guy, Hanun, he loses everything. He's exposed before a greater enemy, and he will now lose everything. So that's what the chapter is. I think it's wonderful. And there's not loads in there that we can really learn, but I want us to just pick out two things just briefly as we draw this to a close, as we apply this now from this day to today. As we go into Monday morning, as we go into our week, what can we see? What can we learn? What lessons and challenges are there? Well, I think firstly, it's already been drawn out this morning. I think Joab's faith, it is the kind of bit that kind of stands off the page to us, isn't it? So Joab has been sent by David to go and to muster this army. And there's this great sentence that he makes. Be strong and let us fight bravely for our people and for the cities of our God. And the Lord will do what is good in his sight. So Joab has done his very best. He's done the best of his ability. He has devised this new tactic. He's taken the best of the men and gone one way. He's put his brother in charge of the rest of them to go the other way. He's not just kind of ran away. When pressures come, he's continued to do what he does best. But that doesn't give him any confidence, does it? It doesn't really give him any clarity towards how this is going to end up. He doesn't know. And he says, look, if you're in trouble, we'll come and help you. If we're in trouble, come and help us. Be strong. Let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. He's basically saying, let's be faithful to God. Let's fight for God's people. Let's fight for God's city. And God will do what is good in his sight. I think there's a great lesson in there for us. It's kind of that human responsibility and divine sovereignty. We don't just sit back and say, well, God will do it. No, we do the very best that we can. But at the same time, we rest in God's will and God's plan. Chapter 9, we saw how Mephibosheth rested in God's promises, how he rested in the promise of the king. Well, here, the lesson, I think, is that we rest in the plan of the king. That God will do what is good in his sight. One preacher said, if the Lord does what is good in his sight, then he will also do what is good. What is good in the Lord's sight is what's best for us. And as we go into this week, there may be times where we don't go through things we want to go through, or we do go through things we don't want to. There may be times when there's a battle that goes on as to what we do. Do we stay faithful to God, or do we stay silent? Do we run? Do we flee? Well, I think this passage is telling us that we need to trust in the Lord. Just put our hope in him and let his plan and his will be done in our lives. It reminded me a bit of Daniel, chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Can your God save you from the furnace? Yes, he can. But even if he doesn't, we will not bow down and worship your idol. We stay faithful to God. It doesn't give us any clarity towards how it will end, but it does give us confidence that we are in the right place and that God will do what is best for us. Secondly then, just to bring this to an end, I think we have to say that this chapter is great, but it shouldn't have happened. None of this should have happened. This chapter is all about two battles that go on because one man rejects the kindness of the king. And last week we saw, didn't we, that Mephibosheth would have been expecting to die in many ways as the new king comes to the throne. And he could have turned around and said to his servant, no, it's all a trick. He just wants to get me to Jerusalem so he can kill me. But he rested in the integrity of the king. The king had promised kindness, so he knew the king would give him kindness. And what we have here is a contrast, isn't it? The kindness is offered, and instead it's rejected. The integrity of the king is questioned. And what happens as a result? Not kindness, but judgment. And I think that's a warning that we have to take. That if we continue to reject the kindness of the king, remembering that David here is a picture of Christ, that Christ is willing to offer kindness and wants to offer kindness to us. He says, come and I will give you rest. And I have to warn you that if you are repeatedly rejecting that offer, then there is judgment to come. I think that is in there. I can't get round that. And I think that there are multiple points in this chapter where Hanun could turn around and say, I've made a mistake. When he realizes he's become a stench to David, he could make peace at that point. When the first battle ends, he could make peace at that point, but he doesn't. When the second battle ends and everyone else makes peace with David, he doesn't. He continues to reject the kindness of the king, and he ends up losing everything. I think the writer wants us, not only is he trying to show us David's on the rise, but he's also trying to draw a contrast between chapters 9 and chapters 10. And I have to say, if you feel that the Lord is calling you, if you feel the Holy Spirit at work in your heart, you feel the Lord is leading you in a certain way, It's dangerous to continually reject that and push him away. But instead, we need to be more like Mephibosheth and not like Hanan. We need to come to the Lord in humility and receive his kindness and his blessing and not continue to push him away. Graham, thank you.